So this video lesson is all about adding with negative integers. And just like the absolute value video lesson and the one where we introduce negative numbers, we're going to start by talking about the idea of temperature, because temperature is one thing that we're all familiar with, and it gives us a great insight into how positive and negative numbers work. And so for each of these problems we're going to use to try to tease out how we add with negative numbers, we're going to use that blank thermometer that we used in the absolute value video lesson in order to make these observations. And so the first question, and I'm going to ask you to pause the video and work through this using the thermometer as an idea to start off with, is if the temperature at noon was 42 degrees and at 3 p.m. it was 14 degrees warmer, what was the temperature at 3 p.m.? Now I'm going to ask you to do two things. One is to write down what the problem is in terms of its operation and what you're actually going to do with the numbers, and then find the answer for what the temperature was at 3 p.m. But I'm also going to ask you to use the thermometer idea here, draw it in your notebook while you're doing this, and then come back when you are ready to go through the answer. Alright, so at first you probably noticed that if the temperature started at 42, and then it was 14 degrees warmer, that means we're going to add 14 degrees to that temperature of 42, and we're going to end up with 56. When it comes to the thermometer, that's like saying we're going to start at this temperature here, which is 42. We're going to call that 42 for whatever it is. And if we increase by 14 degrees, we're going to move up by 14. And this isn't exact, obviously, but there's 14 more, and we end up at 56. So that is the math problem, the addition that we're going to do, the sum that we want, and showing it in a thermometer. And so that brings us to a really important question when we're talking about it, and that is, what fundamentally is addition? I'm going to ask you to pause the video here. You don't have to write anything down, but pause the video and think for a moment. Sketch some ideas down if you want to, but what is addition? What does it actually do? Well, the first way we learn about addition is by calling it grouping objects together into larger and larger groups. And that's because we first start learning about things like if we have 5 apples and then add 8 more, how many do we have in total? Well, we have 13 because we're grouping objects together in larger and larger groups. But that doesn't really work well even for the temperature problem that we just had, let alone for negative numbers, that it's really hard to try to talk about a negative 5 as a group of something. So instead, we have to think about addition slightly differently, which is as movements and leaps on a number line. And that's why we're going to use the thermometer, is to show it as leaps on a number line. Our first problem there was starting at 42 and then leaping up by 14 to get to 56. Let's see what it looks like now with some negative numbers. Now the temperature at midnight in this problem is going to be negative 5 degrees, and at 3 a.m. it's going to be 14 degrees cooler than it was at midnight. So we want to find out what the temperature is at 3 a.m. You're welcome to pause the video here and try to work through it on your own if you like. You certainly don't have to. This is going to be an example problem, but the next one I'm going to ask you to work through on your own. So if you want to pause the video, go ahead and do that now. If not, just stay on the line for a second and we will go through it. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to start, and this is going to be very much unlike what we saw the thermometer for before, and we're going to start way up here as an example and call that negative 5 degrees. So that's where the temperature was. And at 3 a.m., the temperature is 14 degrees cooler. And we can think about that in two ways. To get cooler, let's make that a different color actually, we'll make it blue. Makes sense. To get cooler, or to drop something, would be the same as to subtract that 14 away, but we're going to think about it as an adding of a negative 14. It dropped another 14 degrees. This is another 14 degrees dropped. And because it's a dropped, it's going to be negative. So we're going to think of this as negative 5 plus negative 14. We start at negative 5, and we include a drop of 14 degrees, which is going to be an adding a negative 14. So we're going to drop negative 14. But because 0 is higher than negative 5, if we start 5 degrees below 0 and we drop another 14, we're going to end up a total of 5 plus 14 or 19 degrees below 0. So they're both below 0. Their distance from 0 and their temperature below 0 is just going to add on to each other. So we end up eventually at a negative 19. Take that same idea and see what you can do with this problem here. If the temperature at midnight was negative 3 degrees and at 3 a.m. it was 16 degrees cooler, what was the temperature at 3 a.m.? Pause the video, see what you can do, and come back when you're ready to move on. Well, again, we're going to start with a negative 3, and we're going to start with it way up here. And starting with that negative 3, we then dropped 16 degrees. Again, we can think about that like a minus 16, but instead we're going to think about it as it's another 16 degrees below 0. So it's a drop of 16, so it has to be negative. But when we actually find that temperature, because we started 3 degrees below 0, and then dropped another 16 degrees below 0, we're a total of 19 degrees below 0. So as we can see, when we're getting more and more negative, that is, we're adding more and more negative numbers. If we wanted to look at that on a number line rather than on a thermometer, here's 0, here's negative 3, and we're jumping back by 16. We're adding a negative 16. Which means we're getting farther and farther from 0. So if we take 3 steps and then we take another 16, we end up at 19 away, still on the negative side. And that leads us to our rule for adding numbers that have the same sign. Positive numbers we know, but negative numbers is slightly different. So pause the video and write this down. To add two numbers with the same sign, adding integers with the same sign, we add the two absolute values, and the sum has the same sign as the two addends. With positive numbers, this is really easy to see, because with 3 plus 4, we just add 3 and 4 to get 7. Well, what we're really doing is we're adding their distances from 0, because we're starting at 3 and jumping 4. So we are a total of 3 plus 4, or 7, units away from 0. When we have two negative numbers, we're doing the same thing. There's negative 3. We want to go another negative 4 units from 0, which takes us a total of 7 away, but it's negative, so it's negative 7. Because when we add two negative numbers, if we keep moving in the negative direction, we can never get back to the positive end. So to add integers with the same sign, we add the two absolute values, and the sum has the same sign as the two addends. So in these two example problems, the first one is fairly familiar, 17 plus 18. You just have to put them vertically, perhaps, but you may notice that they turn out to be a really nice number anyway, which is 100 when we add them together. For negative 24 and negative 47, when we add them together, we can think about it as if we're starting at 0, and we've already gone 24 steps in the negative direction, we want to go another 47 steps in the negative direction. So our total distance from 0 is going to get bigger because we're walking the same way. And 24 plus 47 is 71. So we're going to end up 71 steps away from 0, except on the negative side. When we add a bunch of negative numbers, we're just going to stay negative and keep being negative. Now I got two more temperature problems to look at, and that's about what happens if we're adding positive and negative numbers together. See what you can do with this one. Don't worry if you don't get it right. That's totally fine. But see what you can do. If the temperature at midnight is 5 degrees and at 3 a.m. it was 16 degrees cooler, what was the temperature at 3 a.m.? So on the thermometer, we can represent that as a 5, way up here. And then it's getting 15 degrees cooler. So we'll call that a plus negative 16, because that's how we're going to talk about it with temperature. So what we're doing is we're taking 5 plus negative 16, which we can also think of as 5 minus 16, but we want to show this as an addition here. And so the problem with this one is we can't just take 5 plus 16 and say that we're 21 steps away from 0, because we're not. 0 is actually here. And as we're dropping 16 degrees, we're going to sort of cancel out these 5 degrees that are above 0 and end up with a bunch of steps below 0. How many steps do we take below 0? Well, if we have to cancel out this 5 and we're taking 16, then we have 11 extra steps to deal with. But this 11 is not going to be a positive 11 because we're ending up on the negative side of 0. It's going to be negative 11 degrees. And we can look at that by starting at 5 and dropping back 16. First, we have to take away the 5 that are in the positive area before we get back to 0, and then we have 11 extra steps to make negative. And since 16 is bigger than 5, which means we're going to take more steps negative than we started positive, our final sum has to be negative. See what you can do with this one now with that same idea. If the temperature at noon was negative 4 degrees and at 3 p.m. it was 13 degrees warmer, what was that temperature at 3 p.m.? Well, to start with negative 4, we'll start down here. And we're going to increase by 13 degrees. Now to do that, we have to undo, so we have negative 4 plus 13. To do that, we have to undo those steps between negative 4 and 0. And that takes 4 of them. That means we have some extra steps then that we're going to take above 0. How many extra steps? Well, we're going to take 13, but we've already done 4 to get back to 0, so we have 9 extra, which means we're going to end up at 9. This time we're going to end up as a positive value because the number of positive steps that we take is bigger than the number of negative steps that we started at, or the number of negative steps that we take. Since we started on one side of 0 and moved to the other, or since we're taking steps in opposite directions, we're not going to add our distance from 0. We're going to cancel our distance from 0 because they're trying to move away. This is like two teams who are playing on a tug of war on the number line. The negative 4 wants to move that way. The positive 13 wants to move that way. So some of that strength is going to get canceled out. So we can see that on the number line with mixed signs by saying if we start with moving 30 and then add a negative 15, which is the same as moving 15 backwards on the number line, you can see that this actually gets canceled out. And what we're actually left with is the same as a positive 15. And so that's our rule for adding numbers with mixed signs. If the two addends that we have don't have like signs, that is, they're unlike, pause the video and write down this definition. We subtract the absolute values, and then the sum has the sign as the addend with the larger absolute value, the one that we're taking more steps on. So again, pause the video, write this down, and come back when you're ready. So let's see a few examples of that. In these examples, we're adding numbers that have opposite signs, which means on the number line, our 17 wants to move one way, and our negative 83 wants to move another. So there's going to be some canceling of our values here, especially if this is 0. That's 17, and way down here is whatever our sum is. So we're going to subtract the absolute values. 83 minus 17 is 66, but since 83, the negative number, we take more steps in the negative direction, our sum is negative 66 because we're going to end up on the negative side. Now, the same kind of thing on this one over here, 47 and 24 have opposite signs, so we're going to subtract their absolute values because they're going to cancel out some of those steps they make to get 23. 47 is bigger than 24, the absolute value for negative 24. So we're going to take more steps in the positive direction than the negative, so our sum is a positive 23. So I've got 2 pages of problems for you, then we're almost done, I promise. Go ahead, pause the video, work on these problems. Remember, when they have the same sign, we're going to add their sums. When they have the same sign, we're going to add their absolute values. When they have different signs, we're going to subtract their absolute values because they're moving in opposite directions and canceling some of that movement out. So pause the video, work on these, and come back when you're ready to move on. So starting up in the upper left-hand corner, we have different signs, a positive and a negative. So they're going to cancel each other out, move in opposite directions, play that tug-of-war. So we're going to subtract their absolute values. And since the absolute value of a negative number is the number of steps we're taking in the negative direction, 42 minus 37 is 5. 42 is larger, which means we take more steps in the positive direction, so we end up with a positive 5. Moving over, this is very similar. In fact, it's the same problem we did before. I'm going to add 47 and 24 to get 71 because we're both moving in the negative direction. So on a number line, there's 0, there's negative 24, and there's negative 47. Both moving negative away from 0, so negative 71. For the third one down here, 75 plus 25, we're familiar with that. That's 100. That's nice and easy. For this bottom one, though, now we have a negative 75 plus 25. So here's 0. Here's our negative 75 we're going to start with, and we're going to move back towards 0. And since our sum, the distance from 0 is going to be closer than 75, we're going to subtract out their absolute values. That should be 5 minus 25 to get 50. We're going to stay negative because 25 isn't enough to go all the way back to 0. So our sum is negative 50. Go ahead, pause the video, and work on these 4 problems, and then come back when you're ready to move on. Well, again, when we have the same sign, we're going to add. So the 2 left-hand problems have the same sign. 18 plus 16 is 34. So positive 18 plus positive 16 is positive 34. And negative 18 plus negative 16, both of them on the number line, moving in the negative direction, give us a negative 34 because we're going to add their absolute values. These two, on the right-hand side, have different signs. So we're going to end up subtracting their absolute values. 18 minus 16 is 2. In the top right-hand case, we have more steps negative than we do positive, so this is a negative 2. In the bottom case, we have more steps positive than we do negative. Or the first one, we have more steps negative than positive. The second one down here, we have more steps positive than negative, so we end up at positive 2. And what that comes down to, and me drawing these number lines like this, is what maybe my biggest advice is when you're adding negative numbers, and that's, when in doubt, draw it out. See it on a number line and see what you can do. So remember, when we're adding numbers of different signs, if we're adding numbers with this, or we're adding numbers that are positive or negative, if they have the same sign, we add their absolute values because they're taking steps in the same direction away from 0. And if we are adding them with unlike signs, we subtract their absolute values because they are moving away, because they're moving in opposite directions from 0, and so they're going to cancel out some of that movement.